What I want to talk to you, thank you very much, about now is about how really a tale of methods in the spotlight in the 2015 general election, and more importantly, what I think that we can learn from this particular tale. So before I start, or as I start, I'd like to ask for a show of hands in response to a question. And that question is, many of you probably know that the Scottish National Party won the election in Scotland with a huge landslide majority. They had formed a majority in the Scottish Parliament before the general election. Of course, they'd lost the independence referendum quite closely, and then they absolutely swept the board in the 2015 general election, really giving a significant upset to the Labour Party. So I want to ask you, given what you know about that, how likely it is you think that the SNP are going to win the Scottish Parliament elections next year. They're 6 months from now. So the Scottish Parliament elections obviously only happen in Scotland for the Scottish Parliament, but of course they've done really, really well in the general election. So what I'm going to ask you is to say if you think they're going to win, if you think they're not going to win, and if you don't know. So could you put your hands up, please, if you think they're going to win? Could you put your hands up if you think they're not going to win? And could you put your hands up if you don't know? Okay, lots of people put their hands up if they didn't know, as well as put their hands up thinking they're going to win. That's a really, really good start to what I'm going to say. Now, imagine that I just asked the same question, not just in this lecture theatre, but in lecture theatres all around the university. And in all of those lecture theatres across the university, the majority of people, as you did actually initially in this room, said you thought, on balance, the SNP will probably win the Scottish Parliament elections next year. Ask yourselves if you think that accumulation of the views of other people make you more certain in your expectation that the SNP are going to win next year. And if you said you were uncertain, you didn't know, ask yourself if the accumulation of all of those people saying all of the same things makes you more certain in your expectation that the SNP will win the Scottish Parliament elections next year. Now, imagine that between now and the Scottish Parliament elections next year, we run the British Election Study, we put on a nice little event, and we get all the people who are experts in Scottish politics and in electoral politics to forecast what they think is going to happen. So they're going to use lots of really amazing, statistically sophisticated analyses and forecasting models. And every single one of those forecasters predicts the Scottish Parliament elections will be won definitively by a large majority by the SNP. Perhaps they don't all predict the exact same result, but they all predict the SNP wins the next Scottish Parliament elections. And now imagine, so you've got that accumulation of data. Perhaps also you've got your own data, which is also telling you the same thing, and that is telling you that the Scottish Parliament elections next year will be won by the SNP. Certainly, if you look at the British Election Study data currently, that's just a hugely significant groundswell of support for the SNP, and you can look under the surface, you can look at questions about what people think about political leaders, about issues, about devolution, about the European Union, about jobs, about Scottish national identity, and you will find that that all lends itself to a view that the SNP will win the Scottish Parliament elections next year. Now let's now fast forward, and we're now the night before the election day. We've had the election day, and a new piece of gold standard research comes out and says no. It says the Scottish National Party have not won the Scottish Parliament elections. Actually, there's it's sort of neck and neck with Labour, and perhaps Labour's able to form a majority, it's able to form a coalition government in Scottish Parliament elections, a huge upset. Now, some of you will know where this is all going, I think. So how do you respond? Do you respond by saying, okay, well, the new information must be wrong, because all of that accumulation, all those different views, all those different experts, all that different data has all told us that this is not going to happen? That's one option. Do you respond by saying, well, people just simply changed their minds at the last minute? So all of that data was correct, all of those forecasting models were correct, but actually what's happened is people have just kind of pulled a fast one and kind of, pulled the rug under the SNP's feet. Perhaps they weren't telling the truth when they were answering questions, or perhaps they've simply decided at the last minute to change their minds. Perhaps all those people that hadn't decided which way to go all split for the Labour Party. So there was just a kind of a hidden potential majority that hadn't become obvious until the last minute. Perhaps the predictions were wrong. Now, it takes a lot to make that call, because all of that accumulation of evidence, all the accumulation of the views of other people pointed towards that prediction not being right, being right. But perhaps you then conclude that the prediction was wrong. What I would suggest that you should conclude is that you shouldn't perhaps have been so certain in the first place. And that's why I said, well, this is going really well, when lots of people said, well, I think the S&P is going to win, but I really don't know, to be honest. So this really tells me that we have the most wonderful accumulation of budding social scientists in the room. And probably I don't need to tell you some of the stuff I'm going to say. So, of course, the reason I'm telling you this story and I'm asking you to think it through is because this is precisely what happened in the general election on election night, where we had, the most polled election in history, the most data-rich election. So we had loads of websites where loads of people were putting massive effort into predicting the election. And pretty much everybody predicted a hung parliament, some with a slight Labour lead, some with a slight Conservative lead, but pretty much everybody predicted a hung parliament, and really if you didn't, you were probably quite lucky. And then on election night, so for myself, we're sort of in the unglamorous parts of the ITV studios in a little huddle with the senior editors who have now all got the exit poll result before we go on air. We can't tell anybody about it, of course. We can't even utter the words in the environment because it's so top secret until the polls have closed. So the question is, what do you do then? How do we as social scientists respond to an environment where all the truths that we thought held were not indeed truths? And so what I want to do is really reflect on some lessons that I've learned and which I think could be helpful for us all to reflect on when we're faced with those scenarios, or what those kind of scenarios tell us. So what does 2015 teach us? Well, the first thing it teaches us is that just because lots of people think something doesn't make it more true. And that's actually quite counterintuitive, because most of the time we think about the accumulation of evidence pointing to greater certainty. And all I think 2015 shows us is that does not necessarily hold. It might commonly hold, but it does not necessarily hold. The second view is that more data does not mean that we are more certain. More data is not always better data. More data could mean more incorrect data. And so as social scientists, when we think, well, okay, I've got loads and loads and loads of data, and that makes me really confident, I would just say, just be really careful. The other lesson, I think, is that the consensus doesn't necessarily also lend to greater certainty. So just because everybody says something is true does not make it true. It probably makes it more likely to be true, depending on whether those people are especially accumulating evidence from a diverse range of sources, cross-validating, triangulating, and so on. But it doesn't necessarily make that more true. And I know as scholars, we're all here because we like to refute. We like to look at what's been said, and we like to have an original take on it, and to challenge and to question and to pose puzzles. And really, I think that's what 2015 teaches us. It teaches us to not be blinded by the accumulation of evidence that looks like it confirms only one particular view. And that's a very difficult place to be. And I certainly learned in a personal level, I learned a tremendous amount. We were asked to do tons of events before the election. Everybody asks us who's going to win. I spoke to the amazing David Butler. He's one of my heroes. He started the British election study, which we obviously now run in Manchester. He started it in 1964. And he's still really wise and he's still really brilliant. And I went to Oxford, I was asked to give a talk, I was asked to predict the election results. And he came up to me, and he can't hear so well, and he was sitting right at the front, and he just came up to me and said, "Jane, never predict." And here is a man who understands this. Here is a man who has lived through the 1974 general election, where also the opinion polls called the election wrong. He had lived through the 1992 general election, where also the opinion polls had called the election wrong. And he understood, in a climate of increasing volatility in the electorate and all of the different unknowns and uncertainties, that it was a very dangerous game in order to predict. Everybody was doing it. I thankfully didn't do it publicly, thank goodness. But everyone was doing it. But there's a more fundamental lesson there, and I'll come to it in a minute. So what should we do? We should emphasize the limits of our knowledge and our data. And this is really a point which is just about good practice, but it's actually quite hard to do in an environment which Gabriel was talking about, where the name of the game is to grab a headline and to make an impact and to have a voice in the world and to get your name onto this, that, and the other, and here, there, and everywhere. It's much harder to do this on the telly, it's much harder to do this on the radio, it's much harder to do this if you're going for the impact agenda, but we have to do it. We have to do it because otherwise social science gets called into question when things like the 2015 polling miss occurs. Now, of course, for those of you who might not know all the details, basically what happened was the opinion polls predicted that the polls were neck and neck, and actually there was this huge Conservative lead over Labour. That has called into question the polling industry. The polling industry uses its political polls not to make money, but to increase brand awareness for their industry and for their particular organisation in order to get lots of business through non-public polling, right? So imagine, under the surface, I don't have any particular insight into this, but I know that the number of post-election polls crashed after 2015 and hasn't come anywhere near to where they have been in usual pre- and post-election cycles. So imagine just how much business they've lost if they've lost the business of the newspapers who want to kind of have a political story about how taking the temperature of the public. But it's not just important for the polling industry, it's important for social science in general, because if we go around claiming more uncertainty than we have, we'll get caught out, and then the trust and the integrity of the data and methods process will be called into question. So, emphasize, please, the limits of your knowledge and of your data, even though it's wonderful to you. It's imperfect. Emphasize the limits of your certainty, and this is something as statisticians in the room will know. We always report 95% confidence intervals. Now, just remember what those are. They're not 100% confidence intervals. And for those people who are doing qualitative research, this is exactly applies. You can make inferences, you can claim there's a relationship, you can say things are plausible, you can say the weight of evidence points in a certain direction, but we can't ever be wholly certain. We're dealing with human beings. They're very complex, intriguing individuals. And when you generalize that up to masses of individuals, it becomes even more difficult. Be open to other interpretations and answers. And this is something that I would really encourage you. I know I'm kind of saying the obvious, but I think it's important to say it. And I'm going to talk about some things which aren't perhaps so obvious in a minute. But I think, one of the things that we have to do as social scientists is put forward a thesis and then put forward a counter-thesis and see if that counter-thesis is persuasive in light of the thesis you're putting forward. Don't just put forward one view and then challenge it and cross-reference it and see if another view is equally plausible, could be more plausible, could be differently plausible in different cases, and so on. So to ensure that the actual rigor of doing social science research is about being open and being transparent. And please don't pin your reputation to something. I say in public, and this is the David Butler story, but it's also about this is not just about going on the telly, or it's not just about opinion polls, it's about anything. Like if you pin your reputation onto something where you say you're, incredibly confident in something when you don't have the grounds to be incredibly confident about it, then please just be very wary. So those are some of they're not negatives really, but they're just kind of lessons that I learned, and I hope just by reiterating them, one of the great things for me was being part of this process. I hope the next time I'm there, if I'm there next time, or the time after that I'll just be sitting back and waiting for the electorate to tell us what they really think. And that doesn't mean that I'm going to be disparaging to opinion polls or not trusting them or not thinking that they show us anything, but I will be less surprised if something goes wrong. And you can imagine, it's a kind of a weird environment to be in when you think, and I had, 75 pages of notes that I prepared, and I was feeling pretty confident. And so luckily I didn't get asked a question because the political story was just running. And so I had a bit of time to kind of get my head around it all, but I might not have had that time. And it was kind of a crazy moment. Okay, so what do we then take from this? And this is what I want to talk about next, which is the first lessons that we take from 2015 are about certainty, confidence, being good social scientists, I think. The second set of lessons that we can take from the 2015 polling miss is what accounts for it. So what does account for the fact that the opinion polls predicted a neck and neck Conservative Labour race, and actually there was a Conservative lead? And I would just encourage you to kind of mull over in your heads, if you haven't kind of been following some of this stuff. It's not for everybody, I'm not expecting anybody to have a burning interest in this, but I think it has really interesting and thoughtful implications for data and for social science and for the work we do in the humanities. So what might account for that? What could be the explanations, and how do we find out the answers? So of course, one of the reasons I'm here is that I help to run the British Election Study, and the British Election Study data is being used as an integral part to answer the question of what went wrong. And I'm also on the polling inquiry panel, which so we're trying to figure out what went wrong. And I obviously can't preempt any of the findings. We don't report even preliminary findings until January. But what I want to do is just reflect as co-social scientists about kind of data quality issues, and how would we go about kind of figuring out a puzzle such as that, and does that kind of teach us anything about data? So what are the explanations? Well, the first explanation is that there's something historical happening. That basically there's an increasing tendency for people either to lie to opinion pollsters, or there's an increasing tendency for opinion pollsters to not be able to sample a really good sample of the population. So as people move on to mobile telephones rather than landline telephones, as people become less engaged in the political process and less likely to want to therefore participate in questions about politics, and frankly that relates to all kinds of social science surveys, not just political ones, or is there something about the proliferation of the polling industry that actually is part of the problem? And you will have maybe heard about cases across the world where the polling industry is equally missing the target. And so the question is there something going on that's changing over time? So one of the ways you could test that is to look at, for example, the gap between the poll of polls, the average polls, and the actual result across time. Is it the case that gap between the prediction and the reality is actually becoming bigger and bigger over time? Is it happening in this country? Is it happening cross-nationally? Is there something about, this over time phenomenon that occurs? And one of the other things that I think that we're going to try to do is to kind of contextualize this particular instance. So the question is, we know it happened in 74, 92, but is this miss particularly bigger? Because not every election is perfect. It's just that this one was a big one. This was a really big one because it was so politically important, and also because it called the wrong party that actually formed a government. And so, but actually that doesn't mean to say that other opinion polls, other elections aren't, a little bit out as well, and they might be out in different ways or for different parties. And so we're going to try and contextualize that by looking at the average error over time and whether this is an outlier. in terms of 2015? And if it is an outlier, what kind of size are we talking about? What kind of magnitude? And actually, 2015 is really an outlier, not in this kind of average mean error, but it's an outlier in terms of the lead of the major party over the second party. So that's where the really interesting focus is. So one of the challenges for us, of course, is to really specify and clearly specify exactly what is the definition of the thing we're trying to measure. And obviously that's something that we're all trying to do all the time, but it's really important here. And of course it's especially important because the implications are so big for the industry and the political implications are so big. So George Fuchs, a Labour peer, after 2015 general election difficulties around the opinion polls, he called for regulation of the polling industry. He called for regulation of any survey which contains politically sensitive questions around elections, i.e. that would include us. And the people who would be on panels as proposed by George Fuchs were journalists and politicians. And it kind of filled us with this sense of foreboding and real fear, actually, that the wrong lessons were being learned from this. And that if we don't specify what the right lessons are, the implications are really quite profound for the way and the transparency and the freedom that we have as a country to do good social science research around the questions of representation, engagement, accountability, and electoral choice. So it's hugely important. The other question is, was there a late swing? And part of that is, were there people who were saying they weren't going to vote Conservative who actually basically always were going to vote Conservative? So kind of ask yourselves the question, how would we test that? How would we know if there was a late swing, if there were people who were hiding their political preferences? Well, the second one's quite hard to answer, actually, because if people hide their political preferences, and if they hide them again after the fact, in fact, if they go on hiding them, how are we ever going to really know what people genuinely believe and what genuinely people think? And of course, that kind of speaks to that question of uncertainty and the limits of our knowledge. And I think, one of the things that I suspect we will do is to try to really clearly say what we can and cannot be tested, what it is possible to show and what it isn't possible to show. And, perhaps we might reflect on different levels of certainty that we might have around different explanations. But one of the ways the British Election Study can help us answer this question is we ask questions to everybody about how likely it is that you would ever vote for a political party. And so we know that those people that said they weren't going to vote, or those people that said don't know, or even those people that said they were going to vote Labour, we sort of have a good sense of their underlying political preferences. And so we can look at whether there was a kind of a latent Tory vote somewhere in the data that was kind of hiding and then emerged on election day to swing the election result. And we can look at things like, we can look at the question of late swing by asking, was there a change in the final days of the surveys that were taken? And of course, what we've done is we've accumulated all the raw data for all the opinion pollsters who are members of the British Polling Council, or I think all members but one. And so we've got their data, and we're able to look at whether those people who said they were going to vote one way right towards the end of the election indeed actually voted that way. Because if there was a late swing, we should really see it in what we call the recontact surveys, the contact surveys of the same people that gave a vote preference before the election. And then what we have to do is make sure that we're accounting for attrition, because some of those people are going to drop out afterwards, so we have to make sure we're comparing like with like. And then some of the pollsters use different modes. So they might have done an online survey, they might have done a phone survey, and when they did an online survey or a phone survey, they might have used different weights. And the weights that they use are ways of essentially taking an imperfect sample of the population and trying to weight up those people who represent the sort of less likely to participate in surveys, weight up their responses, make their responses count for more, so that the resulting data set looks more like the general population. Now, if you use different weights across time, we've obviously got to re-weight the data to try to ensure as much as possible that we're comparing like with like, and to compare like with like across modes as we can, and like with like across the population demographics that we're weighting to. Question, wording and ordering. One of the explanations, or one of the theories put forward, was essentially that one of the reasons for the British Election Study, we have an online survey that we run with YouGov, and we have an in-person face-to-face survey that we run with GfK. And it was said at the time that perhaps we were getting slightly closer to the Conservative lead because we were kind of softening up our respondents. And this is actually, a method you might have come across. If you want to ask people something, especially if it's something sensitive or something difficult or something that people perhaps haven't ordinarily aren't thinking about at the current time, you might sort of get them to do a few kind of leading questions, like, so we ask about, what's the most important problem? Who do you think is best on the most important problem? We ask a couple of questions and then we ask them their vote choice. So we ask loads more questions than opinion pollsters. We're very different in what we do. And so one of the theories was, well, perhaps because we're finding these shy Tories, because we're getting people to actually, first of all, think about their political preferences and then be consistent when they get asked a vote intention question. And so we can look at this because the British election study randomised the placement of some of these questions. So we put our vote intention question at the end, we put our vote intention question at the beginning. Sometimes it was near questions about most important problems, sometimes it wasn't, and we don't find any difference. So we don't think that's part of the explanation. And of course, we also have to then explain why we did get a little bit closer. And that's a topic for another day, really, but it's very detailed. So the other question is, did the pollsters use different ways of treating those people who didn't give a vote preference or they said they didn't know? So if you go and exclude everyone and say, well, those people that gave a preference said they were going to vote this way, was it the fact that those don't knows were actually going to split in a certain direction and we should have understood them better? And that really gets those, sort of the way to analyse that gets to those ways I was talking about in terms of shy Tories. How do we know the underlying political preferences of those people that don't know if they're going to vote? Do they actually vote? So we follow the same people over time, over a long period of time. So the British Election Study surveyed people in 2014. We know how they voted in 2010, even 2005. And then we follow them over time. Sounds a bit scary, but we don't follow them literally. But we keep interviewing them. So we know what they said that they did afterwards. And what we're also doing is we're doing a major piece of work to find out if people actually did vote who said they were going to vote. And this is one of the kind of really important things. We do a vote validation. So we're looking at people, did they actually vote? So those people that said they don't know or they didn't vote, were they actually not ever going to vote anyway? So they couldn't have swayed the election outcome. Sampling is highly important and really, really crucial to getting a really good estimate of the actual population. And of course, the actual population don't tend to vote in very large numbers. So we know that 60 to 65% of the eligible population are voting and participating in elections in general. Sometimes it's lower, sometimes it's slightly higher. That's a huge proportion of people who don't vote. Now, if pollsters aren't talking to those people, perhaps that's going to bias the results. We know, for example, in our online surveys that are run with YouGov, one of the pollsters who, of course, is involved in all the opinion polling, that around 90% of our samples say they were going to vote. Now that's ludicrously high. Some of those people are over-reporting, but some of that is because we're just interviewing people that vote. And so they want to take part in surveys, they find politics interesting, they quite like giving their opinions. But, this is just, part and parcel of the problem that in not just the polling industry in terms of political polling has, but in terms of the survey industry as a whole. So is that part of the problem? And is the samples that people are getting? So obviously many people use quota samples, so they're filling up quotas. They want so many young people, so many old people, so many women, so many men, so many people from these different social classes, these types of constituencies, these kinds of regions. By doing that, are we estimating a sort of version of the population that doesn't really look like the population at all? And are we doing, when we use online surveys where they're opt-in surveys, are we basically interviewing only those people that really love giving their opinions? And so what do we do then when we apply really high weights to those people that say they don't vote? We're not actually really talking to the people that actually aren't voting in elections. And it could be really important because if we're getting those numbers wrong, if we're getting those estimates wrong, there's going to be a huge variation in terms of party support amongst the types of people that don't tend to vote, the types of people that do, and we're going to get very biased results. Post-stratification is all about weighting. So it's all about, do we weight properly? So one of the ways we can understand this is we can apply the weights that the pollsters used. We can look at whether those weights really get us closest to the population at large using population targets. And perhaps we can start looking at whether, with the validated votes, those populations are good representations of the population at large. A key leading explanation is differential turnout. So was it the case in 2015 that people who said they were going to vote Labour didn't actually make it to the polls? And so this is a theory of the polling myths, which is a good news for the pollsters in a sense, because of what it means is that they weren't doing anything wrong. They were simply, people were just kind of overestimating, being perhaps a little bit dishonest, perhaps just basically being a bit over-optimistic about their abilities to get to the polls. So there's various ways we can look at this, essentially comparing those people that voted with those people that didn't. And then there's a question of herding. And so do we think, and herding obviously relates to people acting like a herd, and so was there a sense, particularly because there was a very large number of opinion polling agencies who were interviewing the public, were they starting to coalesce around a prediction because they were worried about being the outlier? And now it doesn't necessarily need to be pernicious. This could happen because an organisation gets a sample of its voters or its respondents, uses quotas or uses weights, and then looks at everybody else and thinks, okay, I think we've got a rogue poll. I think what we've got here is a bad representation of what's going on, because that accumulation of all of that evidence that everyone else is talking about and everyone else is predicting, we must therefore be wrong. So obviously that goes back to that first point I made about not being part of the herd. And so the ways we can test this is we can look at whether the average coalescing, so that kind of the consensus around the 2015 polls, was really higher than predicted by chance. And that's it's a very interesting part of the project. And then finally, we're looking at electoral registration, so postal voters and overseas voters. Could it have been the case that because lots of people vote by post now, and actually during the campaign, they'd already voted? So how do the opinion pollsters deal with them, people who've actually voted? You can't obviously ask people, you can ask people how did you vote? But you obviously can't report that during an election campaign. Like, hey, look, these are the people that voted already. That would be against all of the electoral regulations and all of the polling regulations, and it would be a disastrous thing to do. So how do the opinion pollsters treat those people? So one of the things we can do is we can say, well, okay, we know people who said they were voting by post. We asked them, have you voted already? Have you voted by post? Was there a hidden conservative majority within those people? Were they differentially sort of Tory, or do they just generally tend to be differentially Tory, the types of people that vote by post? Is there something there that gives us a handle on whether or not there was a sort of missed opportunity, a missed opportunity to understand the electorate? Was it the case that there was lots of overseas voters that the polling industry wasn't interviewing? There are, but they're not enough to make such a big difference. And was it the case that people were falling off the register, the electoral register, and that they were more likely to want to vote Labour? And so we're doing a really, really important linking study with the Electoral Commission, finding out which people had registered, when they had registered, and also, of course, whether they voted. So this is what we can do. And I hope it's interesting to you as social scientists who are trying to deal with social science data, and who can, perhaps we can be more aware of the kinds of limitations and difficulties, and also the strengths. This is not, I do not for one second want to kind of rule out of court the evidence from these agencies, but of course what we want to do is make it as strong as we possibly can. So what does the British election study tell us about what the leading explanations are? Well, one of the things that it tells us is that differential turnout was important. So we know that those people who said they were going to vote in 2015 and who didn't are more likely to be Labour supporters, and that gap had grown significantly over time. Some of those people who said they were going to vote Liberal Democrats, if you remember the kind of the Cleggmania election in 2010, the pollsters didn't actually do too well with the Lib Dems in 2010 either in their predictions, and we think some of those people who were going to vote Lib Dem moved over to Labour, but they weren't really probably ever going to come and vote for the Labour Party. Now, what could the British election study data might also have something to tell us about sampling? So we run a random probability sample of voters. And hopefully those of you working with survey data will know that a random probability sample is seen as the gold standard of research. And because of funding pressures over time, there has been certainly a move, I think, to questioning whether we absolutely have to have random probability samples. We've gone into the field after the election with a random probability in-person sample, very, very expensive part of the British election study project, which we've argued for years, and we've really put a great deal of investment into. Now, if it were the case, and our data isn't released yet, if it were the case that our data shows a stronger match to the Conservative over Labour lead, then we would imply, or we would infer, and we would have to test this, that actually sampling, getting good samples of the population was a large part of the problem of what went wrong in 2015. And that is obviously very negative for the opinion poll industry, because it suggests that their quota sampling or their self-select, in the selecting into doing surveys and weighting isn't able to account or isn't able to get a close enough match to the population at large. We have to rule out different explanations. Was it the case, if we do better, is it the case that we do better because we're just after the event? So do people have better ability to predict to actually tell you what they did than they do actually predicting what they're going to do? So that would be something we'd need to rule out. And is it the case that people just kind of rationalise? So now that they've seen the Conservatives one, they just kind of remember differently what they actually voted. People aren't actually that good at remembering what they've done. And do people kind of, or even do they say, oh, I voted Conservative, even if they didn't, because now they see that that's what the majority of the British public did. So we have to rule out those explanations if we're going to say that our sample does better, and that indeed the smoking gun, if you like, points to sampling. And as I say, our data isn't out yet, but those are the kind of exercises we'd have to go through. So if it was kind of people rationalising, we interview people over lots of days, taken months in this field, that's why it's not out yet. So we might look, for example, at are people becoming more conservative over time as they kind of talk to their friends and family, as the election result is, made more and more aware, as people have come to know and to be more likely to misreport or misremember what they did. And we have to therefore control for when the interviews were done, where they were done, whether the late interviews were done in this part of the country or that part of the country. It's a really interesting, well, to me it's a really interesting exercise anyway. Okay, so those are the lessons that I think that we can potentially learn from the 2015 general election. I can't, as I said, preempt what we're going to recommend in terms of the polling inquiry when our report is submitted March, April next year. But I do know for sure that it's very unlikely that we won't be talking about things like transparency. We won't be talking about things like replicability. We won't be talking about things like, getting the closest samples. I mean, we might not be talking about that, but it could be possible that we'd be talking about getting the closest samples of the eligible population as opposed to the voting population. And, ultimately what we'll be talking about, and this was a recommendation made in 1992, and it's a recommendation in 1974 when similar inquiries were held. And that is to be really upfront about the limitations of your data and the amount of uncertainty that you have around it. And so that really is just me concluding in terms of the lessons that I think we can draw from 2015. As good social scientists, essentially, I think this is just a reiteration, it's a re-emphasis and a reminder about the importance of using good social science principles in the research that we all do. So it's a nice instance, I think, of the academy being able to use data to hopefully illuminate and correct and to really improve the use of data in the public sphere. Thank you.